Ever wondered which are the rules that prevent a planet-wide city from collapsing under its own complexity? Take a comfortable sit, dim the lights down, and get ready to drift into the galactic twilight. In the 11,586th year of the Galactic era, Trantor stood as the center of human civilization. Close to the crowded heart of the galaxy, its orbit traced an unremarkable star, but the world itself had become a symbol of permanence. The natural terrain, once rolling with forests and hills, had long since disappeared. Century by century, sheet after sheet of impervious metal had sealed away the planet's crust, until nothing remained of its wilderness but memory. The transformation was absolute. What had begun as scattered cities and fortified strongholds grew into a lattice of domes, tunnels, and subterranean galleries, fused together until the distinction between settlement and surface was lost. The planet itself had become a single ecumenopolis, a world city without horizon. The open sky was reserved only for the Imperial Palace grounds, a rare 100 square miles of gardens where greenery still breathed in filtered sunlight. At its height, more than 40 billion inhabitants moved within this planetary hive. They served no fields, tilled no land, mined no stone. Instead, they administered the empire, processing edicts and balancing the demands of countless star systems. Day and night, blurred under the constant glow of artificial illumination, and air was scrubbed in vast circulation plants, ensuring that the breath of billions never faltered. It was said that Trantor had become eternal, that nothing could undo the mastery of its walls. Yet beneath the metal plates, the old Earth endured in silence, waiting. In the centuries before its rise, Trantor had been one among many inhabited worlds near the galactic core. Its gravity, its atmosphere, its orbital balance, all lay within the narrow range that welcomed human habitation. Yet its true advantage was not natural, but positional. Trantor sat close to the densest sphere of human settlement, where thousands of systems clustered in gravitational embrace. To govern from elsewhere would have been to govern from the periphery. From Trantor, one ruled from the center. The shift from a regional power to the capital of all known space did not occur at once. Kingdom, republic, confederation. Each form had passed across its surface in waves of ambition, layering institutions like the alloy that later buried its soil. By the time it was crowned as the seat of empire, Trantor had already learned how to carry the weight of distant provinces. The physical transformation that followed was less gradual. A world of stone and clay, fragile against cosmic designs, was soon hidden beneath indestructible plating. The process was total. Mountains were flattened, rivers sealed, oceans redirected into vast reservoirs deep below. Every surface was turned into foundation for human architecture. Over generations, the inhabitants forgot what lay beneath their feet. Soil, once ordinary, became exotic. Stars, once companions, became unreachable behind the metal canopy. Only the Imperial grounds resisted this fate. Their trees and grasses survived not as reminders of the past, but as symbols of power. To walk under an open sky on Trantor was not to feel nature, it was to feel authority. The planet had become an artifact, a living machine, its pulse timed to the rhythm of the empire it served. In the 6th millennium of the Common Era, long before the formal galactic calendar began, Trantor was a world of divided sovereignties. Dozens of feudal domains contended across its continents, each grasping at power, with fleets of crewed starships and alliances written on fragile parchment. The earliest chronicles speak of warlords who measured their rule not by the soil beneath them, but by the routes of trade they could control through nearby systems. Among these kingdoms, Trantor's dominion was modest. Its soil yielded little beyond subsistence. Its climate, temperate but unremarkable, offered no unique abundance. What set it apart was its position. Its star lay close to the gravitational knot of the galaxy, within reach of systems more prosperous and more contested than itself. In time, this geography shaped its destiny. What others regarded as a liability, the rulers of Trantor treated as opportunity. By the 55th century, the kingdom of Trantor had begun to consolidate. Its fleets grew faster, its administrative methods sharper. The chronicles of that era describe not only conquest but absorption. Neighbors defeated in battle were not left ruined, but invited into shared governance, persuaded that Trantor's rule meant stability. Out of this pragmatic policy emerged the Republic, a looser but more resilient form of authority. The Republic endured for centuries, binding together systems through negotiated order rather than force alone. Trantorian envoys traveled farther with each generation, carrying not only treaties but a vision of centrality. The idea that governance could flow from one planet outward, balancing distant provinces by appeal to a common core. This notion, radical in its age, laid the seed for empire. As centuries passed, the Republic expanded into a confederation, a web of loyalty stretching across half the galaxy. Records preserved in the later Imperial Library note the methodical patience of this expansion, star system by star system, through marriage alliances, trade accords, or the slow erosion of rival powers. Where war had once defined Trantor's rise, now administration sustained it. The planet's rulers learned that the permanence of authority lay not in victories on the battlefield, but in the paperwork that followed them. Beneath this growing dominion, Trantor itself began its first transformation. Cities thickened, trade routes converged, and the initial layering of metal over soil commenced. At first, it was a matter of defense. Plating against bombardment, shelters against orbital attack. Yet each sheet of alloy remained, and each became foundation for the next. Over time, protection evolved into permanence. What had begun as armor became architecture by the dawn of the 12th millennium. Trantor had already eclipsed its rivals in reach and in complexity. The Confederation of Trantor administered half the galaxy's known systems, and its capital was no longer a city among others, but a city consuming the planet entire. The open lands shrank, the skies grew narrower, and the soil that had once defined its kingdoms vanished under steel. Still, this was not yet the Empire. That title required a further step, one that bound all systems, not only by loyalty but by necessity. The transformation from Confederation to Empire would complete both Trantor's rise and its destiny as the eternal world. In the 11,586th year of the Galactic era, the transition was sealed. Trantor was declared the capital of the Empire. By then, it already governed half of known space, but the coronation of this new epic formalized what centuries had prepared. From that moment, no decision of consequence in the galaxy escaped the imprint of Trantor's halls. The planet was remade in the image of its role, plate by plate, dome by dome. Its natural surface disappeared. The great oceans were sealed and drained into reservoirs buried far below. Mountain ranges were cut down, their stone reshaped into girders and foundations. Rivers, once marking the boundaries of old kingdoms, were diverted into subterranean channels, pulsing like arteries through the strata of alloy. Within a handful of centuries, nothing remained of Trantor's landscapes but memory. What replaced them was a city without edge. From pole to pole stretched tiers of metal and ferroplastic, supporting towers, corridors, and chambers that spread outward and downward. The scale defied the human eye. No horizon could be seen from the streets, for the streets themselves wound beneath ceilings of alloy lit by glow panels that imitated dawn and dusk. Beneath each district lay another, and beneath that another still. 1,000 levels of habitation, administration, and storage stacked layer upon layer, until the crust itself seemed human-made. In this labyrinth dwelled 40 billion souls. Theirs was not a life of production or harvest. Their work was administration, the invisible machinery that kept the Empire whole. Records were filed, decrees copied, disputes arbitrated, taxes allocated, fleets commissioned. It was said that to walk the corridors of Trantor was to hear the pulse of the galaxy itself. The shuffle of clerks, the hum of data relays, the whisper of air circulation systems. These were the sounds of Empire, To sustain such a world demanded a network of support unparalleled in human history. 20 planets, dedicated entirely to agriculture, sent their yields daily in great fleets of cargo ships. Without them, Trantor would have starved within weeks. The dependence was absolute, but so too was the assurance of power. Those who ruled the agricultural worlds did so only at Trantor's allowance, for their prosperity derived from serving the capital, and yet, beneath this grandeur lay fragility. The planet was self-sufficient in nothing. No crops, no herds, no natural sky. Its people breathed air processed in vast underground plants. They drank water stored in hidden cisterns. They lived by the stability of machines that could never rest. For the citizens of Trantor, dependence was invisible until the day it was not. Still, in its prime, the eternal world seemed unshakable. The Imperial Palace rose as its one open domain, 100 square miles of gardens and courtyards, under true sunlight, reserved for the Emperor and his court. Beyond its walls, the domes gleamed silver gray in the starlight, reflecting not nature, but mastery. Visitors arriving from distant systems described the sight as overwhelming, a planet remade into artifice, radiant and eternal, with no trace of wilderness. For 2.5 centuries, Trantor endured in this form, the undisputed core of the empire, the point toward which every decision, every trade, every conflict converged. Its people called it the eternal world, and many believed it would remain so for as long as humanity endured. But history does not recognize permanence. Beneath the certainty of domes and the weight of administration, forces were gathering that no decree could contain. In the 255th year of the Foundation era, the illusion of eternity broke. The rebels of Gilmer rose in defiance, and for the first time in 2.5 millennia, Trantor's walls could not shield it. The assault was swift, but its effects were measured not in days, but in centuries. The rebels pierced the domes, collapsing the carefully balanced shell that had sealed the planet for ages. Towers fell inward, levels crumpled upon one another, and the air plants, once the lungs of billions, suffocated in ruin. Flames spread not through forests but through corridors, feeding on synthetic materials that filled the strata of the city. The great power plants that had sustained the Imperial Palace flickered, plunging sections of the eternal world into darkness deeper than night. The devastation unleashed forces older than the Empire itself. With the domes punctured, volcanic pressures long held in check surged upward, rupturing the alloy with fountains of molten rock. Entire districts sank into collapse, their chambers buried beneath the planet's reawakened crust. What had seemed indestructible revealed itself as brittle. The population plummeted. From 40 billion, only a fraction survived the calamity. By the close of the century, fewer than 100 million remained, scattered amid the wreckage. For the first time in untold generations, sunlight touched wide portions of the surface. Farmers emerged where clerks had once dwelled, pulling away the twisted plates of metal to reveal soil that had lain buried for thousands of years. Seeds were sown. Crops returned. The eternal world became once more a place of harvest. Yet even in ruin, fragments of greatness endured. The Imperial Library, guarded with stubborn resilience, survived the sack. Within its vaults remained the memory of millennia, the records of empires, the seedbed of the knowledge that would later guide foundations of a second order. To step inside its halls after the fires dimmed was to stand among ghosts that refused erasure. For the survivors, the change was profound. No longer did the planet's people serve as clerks of an empire that spanned the stars. They became farmers of a scarred world, tilling the fields where once had stood offices of planetary administration. The very name of the planet shifted. Where once outsiders had called it the eternal world, the inhabitants named it simply home or Haim, a word that carried both memory and resignation. The empire itself staggered on, for an empire is not extinguished by the ruin of a single planet, even its capital. But the sack of Trantor marked the symbolic death of unity. Authority dispersed, provinces drifted, and the long decline already foreseen by the few who studied history and its patterns deepened without reversal. The story of Trantor did not end with its sack. It lingered in altered form, a world reduced but not erased. On its surface, furrows replaced boulevards, barns replaced archives, and the sky, once absent, returned to dominance. From the perspective of its survivors, the change was survival itself. From the perspective of history, it was the end of an age. Thus concluded the great arc of Trantor's history. From feudal kingdom to republic, from confederation to empire, from world city to ruin. Each stage had been marked by layers of metal and memory, until even the ruins became a kind of monument. And in those ruins, the seeds of future chronicles took root. For decline was never silence. It was transition. In the 12th millennium of the Galactic era, at the heart of Trantor's metallic crust, lay a paradox. 100 square miles of open land, untouched by alloy. This was the Imperial Palace grounds, the sole sanctuary where nature was permitted to breathe under an unbroken sky. The palace itself was not a single structure, but a constellation of edifices, marble halls, crystalline towers, pavilions, and colonnades, each representing the grandeur of an epoch. gardens stretched between them, filled with flora imported from across the empire. Trees from the rimward provinces shaded gravel paths. Flowers from distant agricultural planets lent their fragrance to the air. Birds, rare among the core worlds, fluttered through the hedges, their wings beating against silence that elsewhere was drowned in machinery. Here, the illusion of eternity was cultivated with meticulous care. Water flowed in sculpted channels drawn from reservoirs hidden beneath the city, but made to appear as natural springs. Fountains sparkled in the filtered sun. The air was not recycled by humming plants, but warmed by genuine weather, coaxed into circulation by atmospheric regulators, invisible to the eye. To walk in these gardens was to forget that beyond the walls stretched a planet smothered in steel. Yet the grounds were not merely aesthetic. They were political architecture, a stage upon which the empire's authority was displayed. Ceremonies unfolded under the open sky to remind visitors of the emperor's command over both nature and artifice. Diplomats from the farthest reaches of the galaxy were received not in shadowed halls, but in gardens whose tranquility masked the machinery sustaining them. The message was subtle, but unavoidable. Only on Trantor, only under the Emperor, did order and peace hold. The Palace District also functioned as the planet's anchor of memory. For while the domes of Trantor erased the landscapes of the past, the grounds preserved them in fragments. Each grove and lawn symbolized a world beyond. Each imported species, an echo of lands unseen by most of the population. For citizens who never left the capital, and many never did, the Imperial Gardens were their only glimpse of distant horizons. The contrast with the rest of Trantor was stark. Beyond the palace walls stretched the silver gray of alloy, tier upon tier of habitation, administration, and bureaucracy. Within, grass bent under the weight of dew. Outside, the hum of air plants was endless. Inside, silence was broken only by the chirp of imported birds. This juxtaposition was not accidental. It underscored the Emperor's dominion not only over trillions of subjects, but over the very possibility of wilderness. In time, the palace grounds became a sanctuary, not just for rulers, but for the weary. Records describe officials who, after decades in the subterranean levels, found themselves transfixed upon stepping into the gardens. The sight of a real horizon, the scent of soil exposed to rain, could unmake years of routine. Yet access was controlled, limited to those whose presence bore significance. For the vast majority of Trantor's billions, the grounds were myth, a story whispered of an open sky they would never see, even after the sack. The memory of the palace endured. Though many of its structures were shattered, the idea of the gardens lingered as symbol. place where nature had survived amid alloy. Farmers who reclaimed the soil later spoke of them as prophecy, a vision that the planet itself had one day reclaimed. In the late twilight of the gardens, a gardener named Caliver bent to prune a hedge imported from Santani. The leaves resisted his shears, waxy and thick, grown in alien soil, but shaped to the symmetry required by palace tradition. Caliver worked slowly, knowing each branch would be inspected by an official accustomed to perfection. He had never left the grounds, never seen the world beyond the walls. Yet when he paused, he listened to the faint echo of machinery beneath the earth and wondered whether the hedge grew against alloy or against soil long buried. The Imperial Palace grounds were more than sanctuary. They were the stage upon which power rehearsed its own permanence. Every pathway and pond was arranged to remind visitors that the Empire's reach was without limit. An emissary from the periphery might pause beneath a tree native to his homeland, only to realize it now flourished in the Emperor's garden, under the Emperor's sky. In such moments, loyalty was not demanded. It was demonstrated quietly and inexorably. The architecture reinforced the same truth. Pavilions were constructed not only for function but for lineage, each one a monument to dynasties long dissolved. Marble steps led to ceremonial halls where coronations echoed through centuries. Balconies opened upon views designed to impress. Orderly gardens stretching outward, bounded only by the distant wall that marked the end of the open land. Beyond that wall lay Trantor entire, a horizon of alloy without break, the true scale of the Empire, contained within the contrast. The grounds also carried a weight of symbolism for those who lived on the planet without hope of ever entering. In the crowded administrative districts, clerks spoke of the open air as if it were legend. Many had never seen the stars, except as mathematical entries on reports. The knowledge that somewhere above their heads, 100 square miles of soil and sky survived was both comfort and torment. It was proof that nature had not been erased, only confined. Beneath this stagecraft lay immense engineering. The atmosphere over the grounds was regulated with exact precision. Artificial currents kept clouds in motion. The soil, though appearing natural, was renewed by hidden machinery that balanced nutrients. Even the rain was directed, released from storage towers disguised as hills, ensuring that seasons unfolded with reliable rhythm. To the casual eye, it was a fragment of wilderness. To the engineer, it was a controlled ecosystem, no less artificial than the domes beyond. Yet, despite this orchestration, the grounds inspired genuine awe. Visitors recorded the silence of dawn when the first light touched the towers and gilded the dew. They wrote of the sound of wind rustling through imported forests, so different from the constant hum of the underground corridors. For a moment, the machinery of empire seemed to dissolve, leaving only the illusion of simplicity. That illusion, carefully nurtured, was among the empire's most enduring powers. Even centuries later, when the sack tore open Trantor's shell, survivors spoke of the palace as memory. Many who fled recalled not the offices where they worked, nor the districts where they had lived, but the gardens they had glimpsed only once, perhaps only in dreams. It became a symbol of what was lost and of what could perhaps be regained. For Trantor, the Imperial Palace grounds were the heart, not in size, not in function, but in meaning. To imagine the eternal world without them was impossible. They were the proof of balance, the reminder that even amid alloy and bureaucracy, humanity remembered the shape of leaves and the taste of air, unfiltered by machines. On the morning of a coronation, a young scribe named Muriel was assigned to copy the seating orders for the pavilion ceremony. His task was simple: ensure each name was placed precisely according to precedence. Yet when he carried the parchment across the garden, he slowed his pace. Around him, the air was heavy with the scent of flowers from worlds he had never visited. For a moment, he stopped beneath an arch of blooming trees, staring at the open sky. He thought of the office levels far below, where his colleagues labored without ever seeing daylight. Then he folded the parchment more tightly and continued toward the pavilion, aware that even his hesitation would leave no trace in the record. Beneath the palace grounds stretched the true engine of Trantor, the administrative levels. Here, the planet's transformation from soil to alloy found its most complete expression. Where once there had been mountains and plains, there were now layers of chambers, corridors, and halls, extending downward for hundreds of levels. Each layer was an archive of governance, stacked upon the last, creating a vertical labyrinth that processed the affairs of trillions. These levels did not glitter like the domes above. Their ceilings were low, their lighting steady and dim, designed to prevent fatigue during endless hours of clerical work. Air moved with the faint hum of circulation machines, carrying the scent of alloy and antiseptic. The walls were lined with record vaults, data terminals, and communication nodes, each one a vital organ in the planet's artificial anatomy. It was said that no star system, no province, no minor dispute was too small to pass through Trantor's underground halls. Within these corridors, the rhythm of life was unbroken routine. Clerks arrived in shifts, their footsteps echoing across polished floors. Voices murmured in low cadence, reciting decrees or dictating responses. Elevators descended and ascended constantly, carrying sealed packets of information from one level to another. For the inhabitants of these strata, the galaxy itself was reduced to the words and numbers inscribed on paper or encoded in streams of light. The administrative levels were also a world apart, almost self-contained. Housing blocks for clerks stretched beside record chambers, cafeterias beside communication centers. Children grew up among endless corridors, learning to read from discarded forms, playing in alcoves where exhausted officials once slept. Entire generations passed without seeing the surface. For them, the open sky was not a memory, but a rumor told in stories that held no more weight than legends of ancient Earth. And yet the stability of the empire depended upon this monotony. Each decree issued by an emperor passed through countless hands before reaching the provinces, each tax collected in a far-flung system, returned here tabulated, balanced, and redistributed. The work was tedious, but it was indispensable. Without the clerks of Trantor, the empire would have unraveled long before its decline became inevitable. In a narrow chamber of the 53rd level, a clerk named Dahl bent over a desk illuminated by a single strip of pale light. His task was the review of cargo manifests arriving from an Anacreon province, each document stamped and sealed in order. The numbers blurred as the hours passed, but he continued, aware that errors would ripple outward into shortages far beyond his sight. When the shift bell rang, he folded his ledger, rubbed his eyes, and prepared to walk the long corridor back to his sleeping quarters. For him, the galaxy existed only in columns of figures. Yet he knew that one miscopied digit could alter the balance of entire worlds. The paradox of the administrative levels lay in their invisibility. Though they sustained the empire, they were seldom remembered. Visitors from other planets rarely descended into the corridors, preferring the ceremonial halls or the dazzling domes above. Yet it was here, in the quiet passageways lined with records, that the lifeblood of the galaxy was counted, catalogued, and preserved. The deeper the descent into Trantor's layers, the more profound the silence became. On the upper levels, clerks still murmured in corridors, and messages flowed constantly. But far below, in the archives and forgotten chambers, silence settled like sediment. Here, centuries of records slumbered in vaults carved into alloy. Data reels, documents, sealed cases of reports, all were stacked in unbroken rows, each one a memory of a decision once vital, now irrelevant, but preserved as if eternity depended upon it. The administrators of these levels were not emperors, nor generals, nor governors, yet their authority was formidable. A misplaced record could delay fleets. A misfiled decree could alter a governor's budget, triggering unrest. It was not dramatic power, but it was the power of continuity, the capacity to maintain an empire, not by action, but by preventing collapse. Lighting in these depths was subdued, more functional than aesthetic. The walls bore no decoration, only codes and signs that directed workers to the next chamber. The climate was regulated with precision, cool enough to preserve materials, dry enough to prevent corrosion. Even sound seemed absorbed, muffled by the dense construction. For those who labored here, the passage of time blurred. Days followed nights without reference to sun or stars, marked only by the schedule of shifts. The children of clerks inherited this rhythm. Many never questioned it. Entire families passed their lives beneath the surface, generation after generation. To them, the galaxy was a cascade of documents, each signed, stamped, and archived. Distance was measured not in light years, but in the steps it took to carry a file from one wing to another. And yet, beneath the monotony lay quiet devotion. Clerks often understood that they were anonymous, their names never to be recorded in histories. Still, they worked, sustained by the belief that the Empire endured because they endured. The fragility of their role became clear only when disruption arrived, when rebellions shook the provinces, when supplies faltered, the corridors of Trantor trembled, and the clerks understood that no vault could preserve stability forever. In the 112th level, a woman named Serena kept the keys to an archive that stretched for kilometers. Each morning she unlocked the doors, checked the temperature gauges, and recorded her inspection on a ledger already centuries old. Few ever visited the archive. It was a warehouse of memory, no longer in demand, yet Serena continued faithfully, noting each hour, each shift, as though her work alone guarded the Empire. One evening, she paused in the vast silence, hearing only the hum of circulation fans. She realized that when she was gone, the ledgers would continue without her, and the Empire's memory would outlast every name it recorded. Above these depths, the Empire glittered in ceremony and conquest. But in the administrative levels, the Empire endured in silence, built not on spectacle, but on routine. To understand Trantor was to understand that the pulse of the galaxy was not thunderous, but steady, measured in the shuffle of papers and the quiet devotion of billions unseen. Trantor, in all its splendor, depended upon worlds it never saw. The eternal world was covered in alloy, its soil sealed beneath domes, its sky reduced to reflection. Not a single field remained to yield crops, not a single pasture to graze animals. Yet 40 billion people required sustenance every day, and the rhythm of that need defined the Empire's most fragile artery, the agricultural supply chain. 20 planets, each dedicated wholly to cultivation, served this purpose. Their climates were engineered, their ecosystems tuned to produce maximum yield. Fields stretched in unbroken plains across continents, tended by machinery and farmers, whose entire existence was directed toward one task: to feed the capital. Vast silos stored grain by the megaton, while herds were managed with mathematical precision to provide protein without surplus or waste. These planets were the lungs and stomach of Trantor, inhaling sunlight and soil to exhale food across the stars. The system operated with the precision of a heartbeat. Each day, fleets of cargo ships lifted from the agricultural worlds, their holds packed with the harvest. Thousands of vessels crossed hyperspace lanes, converging on Trantor in coordinated flows. Their arrival was staggered to the hour, for even a small delay could ripple disastrously across the capital's population. Once docked, the cargo was transferred to subterranean depots where conveyors and pipelines distributed it downward through the layers of the city. To the inhabitants of Trantor, the process was invisible. Meals arrived in cafeterias. Food markets remained stocked. Kitchens prepared their dishes, as if by inevitability. Few paused to wonder at the fragile chain that sustained them. For the majority, hunger was an abstract word belonging to the past or to distant provinces. The capital was eternal, and so too it seemed was its nourishment. Yet fragility clung to every link. A rebellion on a supply world could send shortages rippling into the capital. A failed harvest, a disrupted hyperspace lane, a strike among freighter crews, each carried the potential to turn abundance into famine. The Empire's armies could suppress revolt. Its governors could restore order, but the dependence itself could not be erased. Trantor had traded soil for certainty, and in that bargain had bound itself to vulnerability. On a distant supply planet, a farmer named Hallen walked the edge of a wheat field that stretched farther than sight. The crop was uniform, the rows exact, each stalk engineered to grow to the same height. His task was simple: to ensure that the harvest machines passed without obstruction. Each morning he inspected the irrigation channels, recorded the moisture levels, and reported the figures to the planetary overseer. He knew none of the grain would remain here. It was bound for Trantor, as it always had been. In the evenings, when he looked at the horizon, he thought of a world he would never see, a world that consumed his labor without ever acknowledging his existence. The supply chain was not only practical, but symbolic. It reminded every province of the galaxy that Trantor was supreme. To feed the capital was to confirm loyalty, to withhold was to risk annihilation. Thus, agriculture and politics intertwined as inseparably as soil and seed. The flow of sustenance into Trantor was more than logistics. It was ritual. Each dawn, the sky above the capital filled with the streaks of arriving freighters. Their hulls bore the insignia of distant provinces, yet once they docked, they became indistinguishable in function. The cargo was weighed, inspected, and passed into the hidden arteries of the city. From there, it vanished into the labyrinth, transformed into meals, consumed without thought by billions who never considered their origins. At the subterranean depots, workers coordinated this daily miracle. Conveyors hummed with the steady pace of inevitability, moving crates of grain, vats of preserved proteins, and shipments of fruit into cold storage. Mechanical lifters stacked goods into place while supervisors marked tallies on endless rosters. Few paused to consider the enormity of what they managed. For them, it was routine. But without their vigilance, the capital's order would collapse within weeks. In the administrative records, the supply worlds were listed with sterile precision. 20 planets, 20 quotas, 20 fleets. But behind the numbers lay entire civilizations, reshaped to serve a singular purpose. On those worlds, every decision, agricultural methods, settlement patterns, even education, revolved around the demand of Trantor. Children grew up knowing that their harvests would vanish into cargo holds, never to be eaten at home. Seasons were measured not by local festivals, but by shipping schedules. The imbalance bred quiet resentment. Farmers knew their toil vanished into the maw of a distant planet, consumed by people who had never seen a field. Some whispered of rebellion, though most understood the futility. The Empire would tolerate many forms of dissent, but disruption of the capital's supply lines was not one of them. Armies could be dispatched, fleets could blockade, but hunger was intolerable. To threaten Trantor's food was to threaten the Empire's heart. The collapse of the system, when it came centuries later, revealed the depth of dependence. With the sack of Trantor, supply fleets faltered, agricultural planets shifted their allegiance, and the arteries that had sustained the eternal world constricted. For the first time in millennia, hunger returned to the capital. It was then that farmers reclaimed the buried soil, tearing away alloy plates to plant anew, as if history itself were unsealing the past. In one of Trantor's subterranean distribution depots, a worker named Arteries supervised the unloading of cargo from a freighter newly arrived from Siwenna. The crates were heavy, marked with seals of Imperial authority, but to Arteries they were simply part of the endless flow. He directed the lifters, recorded the weights, and checked the tally against the manifest. The figures matched precisely as they always did. Yet as he watched the crates vanish onto conveyors, he wondered how long such precision could last. Above his head, the capital continued its routines. Unaware that every meal began in places like this, carried by hands such as his. The supply chain defined Trantor as much as its domes and corridors. It was the invisible bond between worlds, binding distant provinces to the capital through necessity. In the end, this dependence proved both its strength and its undoing. For so long as the fleets arrived, Trantor was eternal. When they ceased, eternity dissolved into soil and silence. Beneath the glittering domes and far from the ceremonial palace, Trantor's vastness revealed itself in districts shaped by history and necessity. Among the most enduring were Dahl and Streeling, places that embodied both the vitality and the fragility of the eternal world. Dahl lay deep within the underground strata, a district of laborers who sustained the machinery that sustained the planet. Its air was hot, thick, with the breath of engines and furnaces. The walls sweated moisture from the endless heat of circulation plants. Here, the people lived in close quarters, their dwellings pressed against the industrial arteries of Trantor. Generations of workers emerged from these shadows, accustomed to the roar of turbines, the metallic tang of the air, and the unending toil required to keep the city alive. The inhabitants of Dahl carried the stigma of their environment. Others on Trantor often looked down upon them, dismissing them as crude or unrefined, suited only for labor. Yet without Dahl, the capital could not breathe. It was here that technicians repaired circulation systems, replaced power conduits, and kept the hidden skeleton of Trantor intact. Pride existed not in ceremony, but in survival, in knowing that the eternal world stood because they worked unseen. By contrast, Streeling carried a different significance. This district, with its renowned university, represented the intellectual heart of Trantor. Where Dahl was fire and industry, Streeling was calculation and thought. Its streets, quieter than most, wound between lecture halls, research chambers, and archives filled with knowledge drawn from across the galaxy. Scholars debated in dimly lit chambers, their words echoing across vaulted ceilings as they tested theories that might shape the Empire's future. It was in Streeling that Hari Seldon first articulated the outlines of psychohistory, the science that would foretell the Empire's decline and guide its restoration. The district's culture of inquiry, preserved even amid the bureaucracy of the capital, allowed speculation that elsewhere might have been dismissed as heresy. In this way, Streeling became more than a district. It became a fulcrum on which history turned. The contrast between Dahl and Streeling mirrored Trantor itself. One side hidden in labor, the other elevated in intellect. Yet both were bound together within the same metallic shell, both necessary for the capital's survival. To move between them was to experience the extremes of Trantorian life, from the roar of furnaces to the silence of libraries, from the sweat of labor to the ink of scholarship. In a furnace hall of Dahl, a boy named Remor carried tools for his father, who tightened valves on a roaring turbine. The metal was hot enough to burn through gloves, and steam hissed from cracks in the pipes. Remor worked without complaint, passing wrenches, cleaning fittings, learning the rhythm of the machines. He had never seen the palace gardens, never touched soil, but he knew that without the furnace, the air would falter, and billions above would choke. His pride was silent, forged in heat. The districts of Trantor were worlds within a world. Each carried its own rhythms, its own loyalties, its own burdens. And yet all were enclosed within the same planetary shell, bound together by necessity, unseen by the galaxy that judged only the grandeur of the capital. If Dahl and Streeling showed the labor and the intellect of Trantor, Mycogen and Y revealed its traditions and its ambitions. Together, they stood as reminders that beneath the alloyed surface, the planet was not a single entity, but a mosaic of districts, each with its own past, each carrying its own identity. Mycogen was a place of memory, where ancient rituals survived in defiance of the capital's homogenizing power. Its people traced their lineage back to the first settlers, and their customs remained rooted in times before the Empire. Within its walls, clothing differed from the rest of Trantor. Long robes, hoods, and garments that spoke of reverence rather than utility. The inhabitants preserved stories of Earth, tales of origins that most of the galaxy had forgotten or dismissed. To them, Trantor was not only a capital, but a stage on which ancient heritage had been buried, and they guarded fragments of that past with unyielding devotion. The district's economy reflected its insularity. Mycogen specialized in yeast cultures, producing foodstuffs that fed much of the capital. Their vats and laboratories stretched through subterranean caverns, tended with precision and secrecy. Outsiders were seldom admitted. Even Imperial officials entered with caution, aware that Mycogen's loyalty was conditioned not by force, but by a pact of non-interference. Y, by contrast, embodied ambition. Situated near the planet's surface, it was wealthier, more politically active, and more willing to challenge the authority of the center. Its leaders maintained private militias, trained in secrecy, preparing for moments when opportunity might break the capital's rigid hierarchy. In wise corridors, whispers of revolt passed quietly, for its rulers dreamed of replacing the palace itself, imagining their district as the new heart of the empire. The rivalry between Y and the central authority became most evident during the flight of Hari Seldon. When political tension threatened to erupt into open coup, it was in Y that alliances formed. And it was in Y that the illusion of Trantor's stability showed its cracks. Though the revolt was quelled, the district's memory endured, a symbol of resistance against a world otherwise bound to obedience. The juxtaposition of Mycogen and Y reflected Trantor's contradictions. In one, history clung stubbornly to fragments of the past. In the other, ambition surged toward futures that the palace sought to deny. Together, they reminded the galaxy that the capital was not uniform, but fractured. Its unity forged only by the weight of alloy above and the machinery below. In Mycogen, an elder named Torval prepared a vat of yeast culture, with movements as precise as ritual. He dipped instruments into the thick liquid, checked the readings, and recited an old prayer whispered by his ancestors. To him, the yeast was not only sustenance but continuity, linking his people to a chain that stretched back to Earth. When the readings aligned, he covered the vat and bowed his head, not to the Empire, but to the memory of origins preserved against forgetting. The districts of Trantor were seldom seen by outsiders. To the galaxy, capital was a seamless whole, a world of domes and palaces. But within, differences endured, shaping lives and decisions in ways no census could record. The eternal world was not merely one city. It was thousands, layered and divided, each one essential, each one forgotten in the glare of empire. When the sack of Trantor came, the collapse unfolded, not only in walls and domes, but in the rhythms of life that had endured for millennia. World that had once called itself eternal discovered how quickly eternity could fracture. The first sign was silence. Air plants damaged by bombardment faltered. Their hum, constant for generations, ceased in districts across the planet. Without circulation, entire levels filled with stagnant air. Families fled upward or outward, searching for survival in corridors not yet breached. Lights dimmed as power plants failed, plunging vast chambers into darkness. In a single week, billions realized that the certainty of their existence had been an illusion maintained only by machines, and those machines were fragile. The rebels tore through the domes, shattering alloy plates that had sealed away the planet's crust. With those wounds, fire erupted, spreading across districts once thought immune to flame. Synthetic walls fed the blaze, collapsing supports and burying entire neighborhoods beneath molten metal. What generations had built was undone in hours. Amid the ruin, the population dwindled. Some perished in the collapse. Others fled into space, scattering to provinces that offered no welcome. Within a generation, the capital of 40 billion had become a broken city of less than 100 million. Survivors scattered among ruins that stretched from pole to pole. What emerged in place of the eternal world was something no one had expected. Agriculture. With the domes shattered, sunlight touched the soil for the first time in centuries. The survivors, desperate for food, cleared rubble and tore away broken plating to reach the ground beneath. The soil was dry, yet still fertile after its long burial. Seeds were planted, crops coaxed into life, and the rhythms of farming returned to a world that had forgotten them. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it complete. Metal debris still littered the fields. Towers stood as broken spires, casting shadows across furrows of grain. Farmers plowed between ruins, guiding their animals past the remnants of collapsed domes. It was survival, not restoration. Yet with each harvest, the survivors reclaimed a fragment of continuity. Not as clerks of an empire, but as stewards of soil. The change marked more than survival. It marked humility. Trantor, Once the capital of all known space had become one world among many, reduced to feeding itself, as others had always done, to the galaxy. It was a symbol of decline. To its survivors, it was proof that life endured even when empire did not. In a field carved from the ruins of a collapsed dome, a woman named Nira guided a plow pulled by a pair of weary beasts. The soil was uneven, littered with fragments of alloy that her children gathered into piles at the edge of the field. Each step was laborious, each furrow shallow. Yet when the plow cut through the earth, she smelled the freshness of soil unseen for millennia. That scent, more than the harvest to come, convinced her that the world could live again. Trantor's collapse was not a single moment but an era. Fires burned for decades, ruins shifted, and survivors rebuilt their lives amid the rubble. Yet even in devastation, fragments of memory endured. Libraries, archives, stories passed from one generation to the next. The eternal world had fallen, but it had not vanished. The sack of Trantor did more than destroy walls and scatter populations. It severed the illusions that had bound the galaxy together. For centuries, the Empire had projected strength through the grandeur of its capital. With Trantor in ruins, that projection collapsed, leaving provinces adrift, uncertain whether to obey decrees issued from a city reduced to farmland. The imperial throne survived, but only in name. Emperors continued to be crowned, their ceremonies carried out among shattered halls or reconstructed pavilions. Yet their authority was fragile, more a shadow of habit than an instrument of power. Governors ruled their sectors. With growing independence, armies swore allegiance more to local strongmen than to the palace. The center had ceased to hold, and the galaxy began its long slide into fragmentation. For the people who remained on Trantor, life was defined by contrast. Fields of grain grew beside ruins of alloy. Farmers guided animals past rusting machinery. Children played among collapsed corridors, climbing the skeletons of towers that once housed billions. The city had become a patchwork of survival, half ancient ruin, half new beginning. The change reshaped memory as well as landscape. Where once the people of Trantor had thought of themselves as administrators of a galaxy, they now saw themselves as keepers of soil. Pride shifted from efficiency of bureaucracy to endurance of harvest. To many, it felt less like decline and more like return, a reawakening of something buried too long beneath alloy. And yet the shadow of the Empire remained. Survivors still spoke of the days when the capital had stretched unbroken across the planet. They passed down stories of domes that covered oceans, of corridors that reached deeper than mountains. Even as they planted and harvested, they carried the memory of a city that had defined humanity's greatest age. On the outskirts of a collapsed administrative hall, a boy named Karen gathered scraps of alloy with his father. The fragments were heavy, jagged, remnants of ceilings that had once gleamed under artificial light. Karen stacked them into piles, clearing space for a small field of barley. As he worked, he asked what the building had once been. His father paused, staring at the twisted beams, and replied that it had been a place where men counted the stars. The boy looked at the soil beneath his feet and wondered if such counting had been worth the ruin it left behind. The collapse of Trantor was both end and beginning. The empire fractured, its provinces drifting into isolation. But the planet endured, reshaped into something humbler, something that reminded humanity of its origins. What had been the eternal world became once again a world among worlds. Its soil open to the sun, its people bound not to bureaucracy, but to harvest. In this transformation lay a paradox. Trantor had fallen, yet by falling it had survived. It was no longer eternal, yet it endured in ways the empire itself could not. Amid the collapse, one institution endured with tenacity that defied ruin: the Imperial Library of Trantor. While domes crumbled and streets filled with ash, its archivists guarded their vaults as if guarding the soul of humanity itself. The library had been conceived not as a collection of books, but as a memory of civilization, stretching through subterranean chambers that rivaled the scale of entire districts. It contained the knowledge of millions of worlds, histories, sciences, philosophies, works of art. Shelves extended into darkness, lined with reels, data crystals, and volumes inscribed in scripts from forgotten colonies. To walk its halls was to step into an echo of eternity. During the Empire's height, scholars traveled from across the galaxy to consult its archives. Their voices filled the reading chambers, debating interpretations, tracing genealogies of thought, and building upon discoveries preserved through centuries. The library was not simply a place of preservation. It was a living engine of continuity, connecting each generation to those that had come before. When the sack struck, flames licked at its outer halls, but the inner vaults were spared. Archivists sealed doors, diverted power to circulation systems, and guarded entrances with desperate resolve. Many perished in the attempt, yet the core of the collection survived. In this act of resistance, knowledge itself was preserved, while the empire it served collapsed into fragments. The library's survival altered its meaning. Once a symbol of imperial grandeur, it became instead a beacon of resilience. For scholars who remained, the ruined city outside was secondary. What mattered was that memory endured. They worked amid shortages, copying fragile texts, maintaining delicate machines, and cataloging knowledge even as their own world fell into famine. its existence carried weight beyond Trantor. When word spread that the library had survived, distant provinces took comfort in the idea that the galaxy's memory had not been erased. Even worlds no longer loyal to the Empire sent scholars or messengers, eager to know that their own past was still contained in its vaults. The paradox was clear. While Trantor had lost its walls, its armies, and its authority, it still held the memory of humanity, and memory proved more enduring than power. In a dim reading chamber, a scholar named Lyron copied a damaged reel onto fresh crystal. The words were ancient, a treatise on mathematics from a world long lost to history. His hands trembled as he worked, not from fear but from hunger, for food was scarce in the ruined city. Yet he persisted, knowing that if he failed, the knowledge would vanish. When the transfer was complete, he placed the crystal carefully into a case, whispering the name of the forgotten author. For a moment, the silence of the chamber seemed to carry that name farther than any empire ever had. The Imperial Library became, in its endurance, the last fragment of the eternal world. Not a palace, not a dome, but a vault of memory. The foundation upon which the future would one day be built. The Imperial Library was more than the sum of its archives. It was the embodiment of continuity. To enter its vaults after the sack was to feel the contrast between devastation and endurance. Outside, Trantor lay shattered. Its towers collapsed, its fields newly sown. Inside, the careful order of knowledge persisted, row upon row, shelf upon shelf, undisturbed by fire or famine. For the survivors, this preservation became a source of meaning. Farmers who plowed the reclaimed soil sent their children to study in the remnants of the library, believing that knowledge, like harvest, must be cultivated. Scholars walked among the ruins, teaching under collapsed arches, copying texts on makeshift desks, their devotion unbroken by scarcity. To them, the library was no longer an imperial ornament, but a covenant, proof that humanity remembered. It was here that seeds of the future were planted. The Selden Project, which sought to guide history through the science of psychohistory, drew strength from the survival of the library. Its archives supplied the precedent, the data, the models upon which equations could be built. Without the preservation of knowledge on Trantor, the vision of a second empire rising from the ashes of the first might never have taken shape. Even for those who no longer believed in empire, the library's endurance mattered. It reminded them that civilization was not measured only by power, but by memory. Empires rose and fell, palaces burned, and armies scattered. But the words and thoughts of generations endured when preserved. In this sense, the library was eternal, not the city that housed it. travelers who came centuries later described the atmosphere of the place. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows across endless aisles. Dust gathered in corners, stirred only by the footsteps of archivists. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of paper and old machinery. Silence dominated, broken only by the turning of pages or the whisper of styluses across new crystal. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of reverence, as though the walls themselves remembered. The library's influence reached far beyond Trantor. Though the city was reduced to ruins, though its people tilled fields where once they had copied decrees, the reputation of its archives endured across the galaxy. To know that knowledge survived was to know that hope survived. To believe in continuity, even in collapse, was to believe that history was not random, but could be shaped. Among the shelves of an obscure wing, a girl named Solora searched for a text her mentor had requested. The aisles stretched farther than she could see, filled with reels labeled in languages she could not read. At last she found it, a record of agriculture from the earliest settlements beyond the core. She lifted it carefully, brushing dust from its casing, and carried it back through the silence. Outside, her family worked the soil for the first time in generations. Inside, she carried a fragment of knowledge that promised to guide them. In her hands, memory and survival touched. The Imperial Library, in surviving, altered Trantor's destiny. The eternal world was gone, but its memory endured, not in monuments of stone or domes of alloy, but in words, ideas, and histories preserved against forgetting. And in those records lay the faint outline of futures still to come. The fall of Trantor reverberated across the galaxy with a force greater than any fleet or decree. No single event symbolized the collapse of the empire, more than the ruin of its capital. Provinces that had once obeyed reluctantly now declared independence openly. The illusion of unity was broken, and the long decline that Hari Seldon had foreseen unfolded with a rhythm that could not be halted. Yet Trantor itself endured. The eternal world became a world among many, stripped of grandeur but not of life. Where once billions processed decrees in corridors of alloy, farmers now bent over fields carved from rubble. Where once domes glittered in starlight, open skies spread again, watched by children who had never known them. The library's survival ensured that memory was not erased. Knowledge passed into new hands, carried outward to the foundations that would shape the galaxy's distant future. Trantor had ceased to be the center, but it had not ceased to matter. In its fall, the capital revealed a truth hidden beneath centuries of steel, that no empire is eternal, that permanence is always an illusion. Yet in the endurance of soil and memory, a different permanence emerged, one that could not be sealed away by alloy or undone by fire. in the quiet aftermath of empire, Trantor remained. Its domes had shattered, its palaces had fallen, yet the soil beneath endured, and from it life continued. The planet that once called itself eternal discovered humility and survival. Its greatness measured not in power, but in memory. For those who walked its fields in later centuries, ruins stood like monuments, not to triumph, but to fragility. Towers rusted in silence while crops grew at their base. The contrast carried a lesson more enduring than any decree, that even the grandest designs return to earth, and that endurance lies not in alloy, but in the patient rhythms of soil and thought. Trantor's story was never simply one of rise and fall. It was the story of transformation. From kingdom to empire, from empire to ruin, from ruin to memory. And in that memory lay the shape of futures, yet unwritten, whispered through the silence of a world that had once governed the stars.